The themes in my work, they have grown and changed and taken new directions, I suppose, with the unfolding of my work over, well, probably close to 30 years now. I never add up, the time, but it seems to be quite a long time now. So that the things that would have taken precedence conceptually, say 25 years ago, are somewhat different now, but I can look back at where I was in an earlier sort of aspect of my career, and now with hindsight I can see, I suppose, the seeds of some of the ideas that I've picked up more now. And I would say that every work I do, it doesn't come from nowhere. It comes out of earlier works, but perhaps is a surprising tangential offshoot from an earlier work, and surprising to me, perhaps surprising to the viewer, but very surprising to me that it's only by doing one work that you start to think about a whole range of things that work somehow points you in a new direction, and then you go off in that direction. The work for me is, I suppose, an unfolding of ideas and subjects and various disciplines that I've been interested in. But you could actually see, quite a marked evolution, I think, if you look at the work as a whole. The entrance room to the exhibition, the theme is really that of consumption. I mean, we all, almost all of us, on the planet, let alone in our, urban world in, say, Sydney, live lives where, although some of us are becoming increasingly discomforted by the fact we are consumers, we're consumers of all sorts of resources, whether it's power such as electricity or fuel, running our cars or whatever, or whether it's the food we eat or the things we entertain ourselves with, or the things we wear, or the places we live. It's very, very difficult for us to escape that consumer world. In fact, it's virtually impossible. And this first room actually tries to look at that and engage with that and pass comment about that world that we seem to be tied to. And perhaps an undercurrent of some of the works in this room would be to point to the fact that we are tied to that world, whether we like it or not. Well, the work I'm sitting in front of, it's a very different installation of this work than the one it was finally made for. Initially it was made for an exhibition in Copenhagen in Europe in 1996. The European Union chooses a city as a city of focus each year, and that year Copenhagen decided as part of their cultural program to have an exhibition of shipping containers from different harbour or oceanside cities around the world. So in this work you've got a whole lot of objects that are from really the flotsam and jetsam of our lives, carved from soap. And as I said, soap's interesting to me because it's a product of both cleansing, but it's also a product that is very fragile. It can be easily, worn away into nothing, and leaving virtually no residue ever of its existence. And I think that that's really like the existence of most of us. I mean, I remember hearing years ago someone said that the best evidence of most people in the latter part of the 20th century is that they had their names written somewhere in a telephone book. And I suppose now we're entering an era where we don't even have telephone books anymore. Really, the residue of the evidence of the lives that most of us leave behind is very, very slim indeed. And so I set my shipping container up almost like the hobo's cave, like the home of someone who lived not necessarily on the street, but who lived an existence that was really just a pile-up of the stuff of our lives. And the character who, I suppose in a sense, kind of inhabited, or his presence inhabited my shipping container, was my father, who obligingly photographed for me wearing a cloak I knitted out of Coca-Cola cans. Well, various people have said he looks like someone who's a tribal elder, but at the same time is living, you know, a sort of perhaps a meagre existence amongst the detritus of the modern, urban, material world that we're all forced to inhabit. Then the next room is really looking at, I suppose, the human form and what it is to, you know, to be a human living within a human form. And it deals with, the body in various ways, the body and human frailty with war, human frailty with ideas of ethics and morality, with ideas of sexuality, ideas of the transition from childhood and pre-puberty through puberty into adulthood. Scar tissue, as you can see, is a work of components made from knitted videotape. And the videos that have been knitted are all war movies. I suppose in some wars, like the Great War and the Second World War, there's a certain sense of victory. And I suppose for any winner, there's a sense of being victorious. But the very, you know, notion of war, I think is an anathema to so many people and such a great tragedy. And of course a great tragedy to the environment, which suffers along with humans. So this work tries to encompass all of that. I find it very interesting that pieces of acrylic fabric fashioned into these little forms of, you know, that it's not as if they're voodoo figures exactly, but they do seem to become little figures of power, little creatures which enable us to somehow express and perhaps overcome a little bit the enormous grief that we feel after a tragic event. Being in the world, you know, whether you're a human or a fly or a plant, you know, our existence is finite, and as you grow through life, I think, you know, we're all forced to think about our place within that and the impact that we make upon that world and the way that we interact with other members of our same species, in our case humans, or other creatures, other things. So yeah, the second room is really about humanity, you know, humanity in a fairly conscious, direct way. And then further rooms look at aspects of, well, botany, natural history, and environmental politics increasingly in many of the recent works. When I went to art school in Sydney in the 1970s, it was at the very end of what I suppose you could describe as an academic era of art schools, where you had to major in either painting or sculpture, and whichever you did, you had to do 6 hours of life drawing, a day of life drawing a week for the 4 years of the program. I know art schools now are very, very different to that. But also when I went through, I think it was actually, looking back at it, a great time to go to art school, because although I chose initially to major in painting, I still had to do a lot of sculpture and also photography and screen printing and etching and a variety of other mediums as well. So I got a very solid grounding. My work has followed many of those disciplines in recent years. Even things I never thought that I would pursue, such as etching, I've had an opportunity to work with for a project over the last couple of years. So I didn't know, you know, when I went to art school, really what mediums I would pursue. And of course, in the following decades since I went to art school, mediums which were embryonic at that time, such as video. It was the era of the first generation of video work being produced, actually. but the way that not just video but all sorts of other electronic media has infiltrated in very interesting ways the art world is something that no one really would have had any comprehension of much back then. So I think that, like a lot of contemporary artists, it's not just been that I've wanted to, that I've been attracted to work in a lot of different areas, but that there are continuously new mediums, whole new systems that are evolving, and of course artists are always, you know, they're known for being at the forefront of, you know, wanting to pick up anything new that's come along, and often are at the cutting edge of, you know, looking at the ways that different new media and techniques can be incorporated creatively. So yeah, so perhaps I'm just, you know, one of many artists, I think, with that desire to work in a multiplicity of forms. We all know how important money is, you know, whether we like it or not. You know, money is part of the lives of all of us, pretty much. It's very difficult to get by without of us. Very, very few people in the world can get by with no currency as part of the lifestyle that they either have to lead or they desire to lead. Money perhaps is the ultimate symbol of desire that we have, and is very interesting for me, therefore, as a material to incorporate into the work. This work's titled Tender. Tender, of course, is a term we know refers to a certain human emotional state, but also it's a word used to describe money. Each American dollar, and this work is made from shredded American dollars, each dollar actually has written on it, "This note is legal tender." So there's a pun, a double meaning in the title. It's a currency of great desirability. So that's another reason why I've used it. Each banknote has a serial number on it, and all of the serial numbers of the American dollar bills which I shredded are actually depicted here on the cabinet as a way, I suppose, of evidencing, you know, which actual ones became shredded. Shredding money is, or shredding the American dollar in the USA is a highly illegal activity, but it's only if this work actually went to the USA that the work itself, you know, could be confiscated. The other reason for using or for incorporating the serial numbers into the work is almost as a parallel, a counterpart to, on the face of the other cabinet, which houses the other half of the work, there are the species of birds and the families that those species belong to, whose nests I've actually reconstructed here. And I should add also that all of the nests have been made from actual nests to use as models, because I've been attempting to make the nests as accurately as possible to not just a nest of that particular bird species, but a particular nest, just as each human being looks a bit different. Each example of a nest that each individual bird makes has got, you know, its own sort of individual feel to it. So yeah, I managed to find enough variety of bird nests from various sources from which to work. Just as the interface of one of the two cases that the work is housed in depict the serial numbers of each of the banknotes which I've shredded, the second case has the scientific name of each bird species whose nest is in the within the work, plus the scientific family that that bird belongs to. So the use of the two systems, on the one hand the serialization and the categorization of each individual banknote along with the categorisation of each individual bird species. They're two very different systems of classification, but I wanted to bring those together, just as I brought together the money and the actual form of the nest and the reference to birds within the work. So the text and the numbers are sort of like a parallel clash, I suppose, of alien forms of systematization. To work from a photograph, for me, it's an impossibility, because the photograph, even if you've got a whole series of photographs, they just show you two-dimensional facets. It's really to see the thing in its actual three-dimensional form, but also to work with the exact scale, so that if you sat the two nests side by side, they would be facsimile, you know, not just look the same, but be the same size and have the same feeling about them. That was really important to me. How birds have arrived at, you know, the particular form that they have according to their environment and the scale of the bird and its the kind of habitat, you know, it lives in. Does it live in the tree? Does it live in the ground? Does it have a hanging nest? And what materials are available? It's just amazing how each species has come up with a different design. And every new nest I encountered, you know, in a museum collection, or some of the ones that I made in Sri Lanka or that I collected in Guyana, like every nest, you know, just seemed to be somehow more wondrous than the one before it, and just, you know, the variety. And the nests belong to wide-ranging species. A lot of them are Australian, but quite a few of them are Asian. There's a few African, and there's a number here from South America of nests which I brought back legally, I should say, from an expedition in Guyana in South America I went on a couple of years ago. And many of the Australian nests have been made in some of our natural history museums in Australia, in Brisbane, Sydney and Adelaide. The environmental message here, of course, is one of globalization and the marginalization of the environment through land clearance, the spread of urbanization, pollution, all of those things that we know about only too well now. To be inaccurate and to not pay attention to the detail of one specific species or another is to deny I suppose, for a start, the whole premise upon which scientific classification is based, because it's about looking at that detail. And that's the way that we divide up the world we live in scientifically and give classify everything. And I'm very interested in that, the whole area of scientific classification, but also how that is one system which parallels other indigenous systems, so-called ethnobotanies, and other ways that other cultures look at the natural world around them. And so, in a sense, for me, it's important to be scientifically accurate, and therefore visually accurate, and to pay attention to detail, which of course leads to my work looking very finely crafted, because of that attempt to be as true to the original in some respects as possible, even though I might be using a material and presenting the work in a context which is entirely alien to that of the world of science. This work is the first work I've made where I started to work with camouflage patterning, and that really came out of my experience on that first trip of being in Sri Lanka, where when you travel around the island there are army checkpoints at frequent points along the road where you're forced to pull over and show identity papers, and they're all manned by perhaps half a dozen military people, but also each one consists of a concrete bunker painted up in camouflage pattern, and I just was entirely fascinated by how different each camouflage pattern was. It was as if a head office had sent out tins of black and yellow and green paint and said, right, do camouflage. And there were some very creative examples, which sadly I never photographed, it being a sort of a military, these being military posts. So that's where the use of the camouflage, which is on the objects in the lower level of the case. Camouflage, of course, is a pattern that humans have derived from nature. I mean, camouflage is the pattern that we see in nature of animals and all sorts of organisms to blend into their environment and be less visible to predators. And humans have taken that pattern and used it for exactly the same reason. So really it's a pattern that we've pinched from nature, and in the process of using that pattern for our own ends to fight each other, we're destroying the natural world on which our battles take place. So it's a piece that refers to a lot of those things. And I should also say, in the context particularly of this work being in this room of the exhibition, that Sri Lanka is a thrice colonized country, colonized first of all by the Portuguese, then the Dutch, and then the British. And of course, way back before those waves of colonization, it's a country with ancient migrations coming from India and other parts of Southeast Asia. So it's a real mix of all of those things. You know, when I've travelled in and worked and experienced other nations which also have undergone colonisation, such as New Zealand or Sri Lanka or India or Guyana in tropical South America, and they're all places which have certain parallels, certain shared histories of having to deal with colonial European powers, and that's really informed a lot of my work and I think my psychological approach to art making in recent times. I was invited a few years ago to do a rug for an exhibition, and I thought that I'd do something about endangered plant species in Iraq, and I went off to research that, and because of the political situation there at present, it's very difficult to ascertain exactly what is endangered. So then I settled upon doing a work that referred to the southern Iraqi marshlands, which were a pristine wetland that was with a group of people, the Arab marsh people, who'd lived there for eons. The marshes were dammed by Saddam Hussein after the first Gulf War in the early 90s because the marsh Arabs were not sympathisers of his party, and it was his way of forcing them out of their environment. So on the rug here you have a number of plants which are indigenous to the marshlands there in that part of the world. So they're all water plants, and some of them are quite sacred. The reed here, for example, is a very sacred plant there because houses are made out of it. It's just a very, very important plant that has multi-uses in that part of the world. All of the plants have got their local vernacular name in Arabic script on the rug, and the background is the three-colour American camouflage military pattern, which is part of the, it's the pattern of the American military intervention that's currently in Iraq. Well, the work with the beehives is titled Breeding Ground, and it was originally that the hives were part of an installation in Port Arthur in Tasmania, and they were placed in a garden in the one-time penal settlement, which had since the early days of the settlement been used to grow flowers and vegetables for the officers. And each of the hives, which each one is painted in a military camouflage pattern from a particular country, and the countries were aligned with plant species growing in the garden, which in their the wild ancestors of those plants had originated in the same part of the world as where the camouflage pattern comes from. So some of the examples of some of those combinations are the carrot, which the wild ancestor of the carrot comes from Afghanistan, the cucumber from India. Our modern strawberry is hybridized from two wild American species. So that was the strawberries was with the USA camouflage pattern, the pea from Turkey, and so on. Now, bees, of course, have been used or have been regarded since really the ancients in the Western world, because the honeybee is it's a European bee. So since really the ancient Greeks, bees have been seen as models of a perfect human society, because they exist as a colony and they all seem to pull together and to work in absolute harmony for the common good. And I mean, we know now scientifically that bees are hardwired biologically to operate in such a way that the honeybee bee species can't survive as a single individual. It can only survive as a collective, in a swarm, in a colony. But since ancient times and even now, you know, bees are seen to be hard workers who never complain about anything and who all get on well with each other and exist in a perfect communal state. And of course, as humans, we never seem to be able to get that right. But also, of course, bees, the honeybee, the European honeybee itself is it was brought, as were the plants, as both invaders and captives to the Australian colony before British colonisation. We didn't have honeybees in Australia. We had native bees that, of course, make fantastic honey, but not the European honeybee, which is used for all commercial honey enterprises. And certainly there were no foreign plant species here. So in a sense, just as the colonists were invaders and the prisoners were brought as captives from Britain, that the honeybee is a metaphor for both of those, and the plants for both of those things as well. So yeah. Well, this work, which is titled Castles in the Air of the Cave Dwellers, consists of a number of casts of a human brain, which I modelled with attached to each brain or suspended from it. Each one has a different species of insect nests, and all the insect nests are those of species which belong to the insect family, which are commonly called the social insects, because they're insects which exist in colonies rather than singly, so that they don't actually, as single units, much like with the bees, they're programmed not to survive as an individual, but to survive as a group. It's extraordinary the kind of architectural forms, the homes that insects actually build for themselves and to raise their young. And I suppose it's sort of an offshoot really of the earlier work looking at the bird's nests, and an increasing fascination I have with so-called animal architecture. The social insects, as I was saying before with the bees, have been respected by humans because the organisms that make up the group seem to live in harmony with each other and to pull together. So the title Castles in the Air of the Cave Dwellers refers to, I suppose you could say, on the one hand, what seem to be almost like the caves, which are the actual insect nests, but also the idea that for humans, that social harmony that the social insects seem to live within is like a dream state for us, because it seems to be a state of existence which humans can't achieve with each other. So in a sense, it's like the castles in the air, the dream of what a perfect existence, a perfect world could be. I would like people to look at this work, though, and perhaps think that it's really the insects who are living the dream life, not humans. The humans are really the cave dwellers, not the insects. So that's why I wanted to choose a title that could be read from a number of different perspectives about what the human state of desire for a perfect habitat and a perfect world might be. This work, which is titled Amazonical, was actually shot last year, that's 2007 again, in the Amazon basin in Guyana, which was once British Guyana, a British colony. And it was an expedition mounted by the Adelaide Botanic Gardens, following in the footsteps of one of the early directors of the Adelaide Gardens, who prior to his position there had, he and his brother, Richard and Robert Schomburg, had done botanising and surveying for the British, particularly down south in Guyana, on the border between Guyana and Brazil. And one of the plants which they sent back to Victorian England was the giant water lily, which they called Victoria regia, after Queen Victoria. It's now known as Victoria amazonica. And the Victorian England went crazy over this plant because it's so exotic and so extraordinary visually. And apparently the design of the Crystal Palace for the London exhibition in the 19th century was fashioned, inspired by the Victoria amazonica water lily leaf, which the underside of the leaf has an amazing structure, almost like scaffolding, to support the huge expanse of the leaves, which can grow close to 2 meters in diameter, so that they will sit on top of the water. And it's this lily leaf, of course, upon which Victorians love to photograph babies and young children, because the leaves are strong enough to hold those up. But also the plant has got some interesting scientific aspects to it. It's known now that the flower, which opens on dusk, not only exudes an intense perfume, but which attracts the pollinating beetles, but when the beetles land on the petals, then the flower raises its heat considerably inside. So the beetle will then be attracted to go right into the inner recesses of the flower, and will spend all night in there and all the next day, and then be released by the flower the following night to fly off loaded with pollen to another flower, and thus pollinate the flowers. And the scientists who've done experiments with this plant have found even in a very low temperature, like 4 degrees Celsius, it will still raise its temperature up to about 30, 32 degrees Celsius. So it's a pretty amazing thing for a flower to do. And the scientists have also described the good time that the beetles have all night inside the flower as being rather like a nightclub for beetles. This work is, I suppose, a return of sorts to the much earlier Paradisus terrestris work with the sardine tins, where at first it looks like just another work made from a sardine tin, but in actual fact, in this case, it's a RAF emergency ration tin from the mid-1960s. And intriguingly to me, it has printed on it instructions for what to do with the emergency rations should you need to use them. It says something like, if you need to, you open up the tin and remove the contents, and then obviously to cover disguise your tracks, you either bury the tin in the jungle or you throw it away into the ocean from the dinghy. So I chose the plant form I chose to depict here is one of the giant kelps. It's one of the Australian giant kelps. And the title Holdfast is actually the term biologically for the very large, it's not a root exactly, but the very large anchorage which anchors and holds the kelp to the ocean floor. And of course, the term holdfast, as with much of my work, there's a double innuendo there of, you know, holding on tight, you know, for dear life, to the desire for survival. Well, I suppose because of my burgeoning interest in, well, botany and now increasingly other areas also of natural history, I've become interested in, well, the deeper, distant past histories and origins of the biological makeup of our planet today. And because, you know, I live in the southern hemisphere, the whole geological event of Gondwana, the whole history, the ancient history that goes back over geological eons, for, you know, hundreds of millions of years. That is something which deeply fascinates me, which some of my work has been directly related to, but the bearing that the Gondwanan connections amongst the various Gondwanan countries, landforms, with botany but also with other areas of natural history, those interconnections just deeply fascinate me for reasons which I would almost find hard to put voice to, actually. It's just a deep-seated abiding interest that I have. And it's an amazement, I think. It's a fascination with, you know, the history of the planet and of all living things within the planet. This work is titled Mourning Chorus. That is mourning as to mourn the death or the passing of someone. I did spend quite a lot of time in New Zealand last year, 2007, and did a residency at the University of Auckland, and spent most of my time during the residency going up to work at the Auckland Museum in the Natural History section, where I was able to gain access to specimens of a number of now extinct New Zealand bird species. And I was amazed when I went to New Zealand for the first time last year that so many of their birds have become extinct. They have a very different evolutionary history to Australia. Apparently Captain Cook, when he sailed to New Zealand in the ship the Endeavour, they parked far enough offshore so that the feisty Maori wouldn't attack them in the night. But even though they were parked offshore from New Zealand, he says that in his diary that the morning chorus was deafening. So it's a huge change now. I regard this work, I suppose, as a lament of the demise of the environment, just as much of my other work is dealing with the same overall theme, but in other ways, looking at other aspects of that demise. Oh, I think I consider the humorous aspect of all of my work. Somehow one can be dealing with very serious matters but still find something, a certain amount of wit or humour within the subject matter and then within the realisation of that. And perhaps the wit is borne out in part by the use of materials, but also as I'm working, you know, more and more accurately with natural forms, you begin to observe and to think about what humans might perceive as humour within nature, and nature perhaps doesn't perceive it that way, or although, you know, in a sense I'd like to think that the driving force, whatever you like to call that, you know, behind nature has a great sense of humour. I suppose I see the plumbing components much like little periscopes sticking up on top of the surface of, well, of a membrane, which I suppose is rather like the surface of the sea, with these very organic forms which are based upon, not accurately in this case, but, you know, based upon looking at a lot of forms of coral and sea sponges and jellyfish and so on. And of course the plumbing is permeated, it's riddled with little holes, so the plumbing has been rendered useless. It's almost like the plumbing itself has decayed. And the forms on the lower half attached to the plumbing are made of tiny glass beads, and in a sense I've used beads here rather poetically in this case for that, with that same idea that permeates a lot of my work with using glass beads of the history as trade items, but here it's more the trade-off between, our human existence and the invisibility and of the degradation of what's going on under the ocean. But of course, glass, of course, is made of silica, and silica is the main ingredient of sand. So there's this chemical connection as well between the physicality of the glass itself and the sand on the ocean floor. Well, cell culture, I suppose, came out of visits to natural history museums. I'm a museum junkie. I like looking at specimens in museums, in display cases, but I'm also quite intrigued by the nature of museums themselves and how they display objects and how clinical those displays are, because inevitably all of these specimens have been separated from the natural world from which they come and put in a very clean, protected environment. I think the punning is, fairly self-explanatory, but a lot of it's based upon, I think, perhaps trying to animate the inorganic, severe geometry of the Tupperware forms, so that it's the life forms connected to the Tupperware actually give the Tupperware a life. The Tupperware becomes a body or a major sort of physiological aspect of the particular organism which extends from it. Well, the video here is a video footage of a tarantula which was shot at the Queensland Museum. The spider curator there is reassessing the species classification of some of the Queensland spiders, so he actually keeps live ones, which is unusual in a museum. And this tarantula is one that had babies quite recently. There's quite a lot of little ones wandering around inside her lair, and in the film she simply is doing what spiders do. She's catching dinner, there's some crickets in there, and then she is slowly ingesting in the video one of the crickets, and then she turns around and spins a web, which is very, that's a spider's life. But I think for us, because spiders are so, well, we all know, quite a lot of people are afraid of spiders. So there's something to many people that's quite insidious and quite threatening about, particularly a close-up vision of a spider. So, and the fact that she's in her own lair, like physically when I shot her, but also in the installation here, she's in a little hidey hole, I think adds to that feeling. And the title Stronghold, of course, refers to, the idea of a stronghold being like a lair, a den, a cave, a citadel, a hideout, really. It's a hideout. So she's in her hideout. But in fact, tarantulas live in burrows, and she's just doing exactly biologically what they're programmed to do. It's been an interesting exercise, I think, for myself and for the curators to actually try and structure the exhibition so that there is some kind of logic that's a poetic logic, with the resonance that the works lend to each other rather than a chronological logic in the way it's been put together. Perhaps for other artists or other creators, the idea of the audience and, at the point at which they consider the audience, and if they consider it at all, is a different one. But for me, certainly, and getting back to the strategic idea of the work, the surface of the work, the look of the work being like a lure to entice the audience to reside, to spend time within the conceptualization behind the surface of the work, then yeah, there's a lot of consideration for me of audience participation. But as I said, one doesn't think about the audience first off. That comes at a certain point with the final construction and presentation of the work.